Well, good day. My name is Hunter Hilburn. I'm the Director of Marketing and Business Development at KSA. And today we've got two special guests. One is Peter Van Pelt, is the National Aviation Director for KSA, and Caroline Horton, who is our Content Generation Specialist. We wanted to come to you this morning with some brief information about the CARES Act, and specifically how some of that stimulus money might be used for infrastructure projects at airports. Peter has been following this CARES Act very closely and been monitoring some of the things that might be available to airports, and he's going to talk with us about that this morning. And then we have a series of questions that we'll go through, some frequently asked questions, and we'll get him to respond to that. But Peter, what's been your general observation about these funds that may be available to us that you've been seeing recently?
Well, good morning, everyone. What I've been noticing more than anything else is this is the first time I've really seen the government step up and recognize that this isn't only just a development concern for airports. This is an operations and a lifeblood concern for airports. So one of the things that you'll notice in the Act is it talks about these funds may be used in any lawful purpose where airports can use revenue today. There is a requirement under the Part 5 grant assurances for airports that requires that all revenues generated by the airport are used for the operating and capital costs of the airport. And that's exactly what they're talking about here today.
Okay, let's just get into some questions. How does the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act benefit airports?
Well, it benefits airports, as we were talking before, particularly the larger, more sophisticated the air carrier airports have a hand-in-glove relationship with their tenants in terms of structuring the revenues and structuring the expenses on the airport. Airlines are hurting now. Entitlement grants are given to airports on a pro rata basis if they're not what's called discretionary, and those are all based on employments. Employments have tanked. I saw a figure recently where taking a month-over-month look at TSA screenings were down 90% to the same time last year. So there is a matched relationship between the airlines and the concessions in the airports, sharing costs and revenue, as I described a moment ago. A lot of airports have base fees, but they also have percentage rentals, percentage revenues, those sorts of things. So none of that's there right now. So how it benefits airports is it's just as if somebody had turned the spigot off right now with in terms of our traffic and the revenues that are coming in. There's just frankly no money coming in. And this act supports airports by providing grant revenues that allow them to supplement that revenue stream coming into the airport to get us through these tough times.
Caroline, did you have a question?
Yes, so who would be eligible to receive funding through the CARES Act?
Well, that's a great question, Caroline. Any airport that it has, a publicly sponsored airport that is in the NIPIAS, which is the National Integrated Plan of Airport Systems, is eligible for a CARES Act grant. So in fact, all of our public airport clients out there and some of the private clients that are out there that are considered airport sponsors as defined by the FAA are eligible for these funds in various entitlement formula based upon the type of airport that they are. And we can go through those if you'd like as well.
Okay. Peter, where is the funding coming from for this act?
Well, interestingly, the funding comes from the general fund of the U.S. Treasury, where typical grants that we receive from the Airport Improvement Trust are based upon either a percentage of sales or a percentage of ticket cost through the revenues generated by the air carriers. This is not the case here. This is general fund revenues from the U.S. Treasury.
Okay.
So Peter, what is the period of availability to obligate or spend the CARES Act funding?
Well, interestingly, Caroline, the money's there until it runs out. So there is not a set period in which someone can apply, but I do suspect that funds will run out quick. This is $10 billion. $500 million of the funding will be used to allow grants in the 2020 fiscal year of the government grant cycle to be at 100% as opposed to a 90-10 grant or an 80-20, 75-25 grants here. So that's one way that it works. And then there's $7.4 billion based upon an apportionment formula for primary airports. Those are those which enplane passengers in the commercial air service sense. Non-hubs, small hubs, medium hubs, and large hub airports. And for just let me scale this for you a little bit. Someplace like Tyler would be considered a non-hub airport. Someplace like Harlingen would be considered a small hub airport. Someplace like Austin would be considered a medium hub airport, and DFW or Houston would be large hub airports to give you a sense of those sorts of airports. So then there's $8.7 billion there, another $2 billion based upon the same criteria that's used for how grants are metered out today. And then there's $100 million for general aviation airports, non-primary airports. And the devil's a little bit in the details and how that money will be fleshed into the system and the benchmarks by which your percentage or your participation will be measured.
Peter, you mentioned that there's, the funds are going to be available until they're exhausted.
Right.
But is there a specific deadline for application for these funds? So some grant programs have an application deadline of March 31st, for example, or is this a situation where you got to get your application in very quickly for these funds?
Well, I'm not seeing anything as I'm looking through these notes here, Hunter, that says there's a deadline for application. But as I'm familiar with and have been these past few years involved with airports, there's no time like the present to apply.
Right.
And those who get in first wind up generally getting most.
Okay.
But I would, as greater project definition is provided, I think it behooves airports to jump on this.
Okay.
Is there a specific way the funding will be allocated to the airport sponsors?
You bet there will. And we talked a little bit about that before. Now this speaks to those airports that I mentioned before. Remember we talked about Tyler, Harlingen, Austin, and DFW. Those sorts of airports, the lion's share of this, the $8.7 billion, has an apportionment formula that's very interesting and I think very considered of the financial crisis the airports are facing. So 50% of that money, 50% of the $8.7 billion, will be based upon your percentage that you'd received through the grant revenues for development programs through the airport improvement program itself. So the other 50%, 25% of that is based upon your particular airport's debt service to the total debt service of all U.S. airports. So what this recognizes is those airports that have engaged in costly capital programs to push the system forward are probably going to be carrying a higher level of debt service and are at risk of their scarce capital funding. So they are recognized for that ratio between what all airports owe and what their airport owes. And then the third portion of this, so we have 50, 25, and 25, is an examination of unrestricted cash reserves to your annual debt service. So what this does, this recognizes those airports now that are spending left and right, trying to keep up, recognizing that they won't be able to do this forever. Those who have been in situations that have been hit hardest and hit the most, that 25% is to try to recognize the depletion of their unrestricted cash.
Okay. How is the 100% federal share determined?
Well, let me take a look here. The 100%, it's determined for grants that are the 2020 calendar or the 2020 fiscal year. Any existing 2018 grants, 2019 grants do not apply to this program. It's 2020 grants for all airports. If you have a grant in there today and you have it scheduled at 90-10, you will not be paying your 10% share. $1 million grant, $100,000 local share, that's money you won't have to spend.
Okay.
Peter, do these CARES grants have a local match?
Well, the local match will not be applicable for this round of the CARES Act. 100% of it will be paid for by the FAA. Now, one of the things that I normally assume when we had the last economic downturn, and I can't remember the name of this. We always called it just the stimulus package was put together. It was all about capital funding, and it was through that capital spending that we were trying to kickstart and boost the economy. So there is that same component here. You are allowed to use develop these funds for development projects on your airport. So if you've been a incredibly wise fiscal steward, if you've been very conservative, you might have some opportunities to look at development programs, special capital off the shelf programs that you need to get done that you might be able to get done through this act. But for the most part and by and large, I think this is going to wind up helping the operating costs of airports.
You just touched on that just briefly. The next question that we have is how can an airport sponsor use the CARE grant funds? And you just mentioned that they could use these for development, where in the past they wouldn't be able to do that because it was infrastructure based. So I'm hearing you say that's not the case this time around.
That's correct. Any lawful purpose, and that's I'm
Mhm.
sure was a. In fact, I'm actually certain that was a very calculated use of term there. Any lawful purpose that you can spend revenue for on an airport, you can use these funds for. So again, we're talking about debt service, we're talking about payroll, we're talking about uh, capital costs that you may have coming up. Any of those things that you can do with revenue generated on the airport, you can use the CARES Act funding for.
Yeah, and I guess that's the key here is that they're trying to, we talked a little bit before this call is about survival for these airports.
Right.
And we can talk about infrastructure all day long, but when we talk about development opportunities and providing infrastructure for those airports to get sustainable funding for the long term, I think that would be a priority for this CARES Act. Is kind of what I
Oh,
hear you.
absolutely. And I'm going to stay on this one like a rat on a Cheeto. We need to, there are still the devil's always in the details, and especially for the $100 million for general aviation airports. There is a wonderful paragraph that is less than defined. The more words they use, the more confused I seem to be on how it will be apportioned and spent by the airports in our country. If you take a look at the thousands of general aviation airports in the country, $100 million doesn't go a long way, but it's a heck of a lot better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And I
Right.
think it does help. And the smaller airports, by their nature, by the fact that they don't have um, a lot of revenue today, they've had to be fairly fiscally conservative. And
Hmm.
so they may not be at quite the great financial risk that some of the larger, more robust airports are. So
Hmm.
I can see why it's minimized. The CARES Act is a bit minimized for general aviation airports because you're looking for those airports that are putting passengers in the system, that have significant financial obligations to meet. Those airports are the ones that I believe Congress is worried about first and foremost. It doesn't mean that GA airports don't have obligations, and many of them carry debts. But on
Hmm.
the scale of things, they tend to be more modest and more in line with typical municipal spending than they are at a someplace like an Austin or Houston or McAllen or Tyler.
Yeah, yeah. Carolyn, jump down to that last question for Peter there.
Are there any are there any specific requirements for accepting CARES Act grant funds?
Well, that's a good question here. It says the airport sponsor must continue to employ through December 31st, 2020, at least 90% of the employees they had on the payroll when they accepted the grant. Now, it's interesting also that for certain considerations, Secretary of Transportation can waive that provision of the act. This is very common. I remember working one time receiving $1 million in grant from the U.S. Department of Commerce as part of a flood relief package for one of the airports that I worked at during the time. We had 10 foot of water come through and completely decimate an airport when I was in the Midwest many years ago. And it had that same requirement. We're going to give you this money, but the string attached is this is for economic generation, this is for job support, this is for job generation, and we don't want you just to take the money and run. We don't want you to take the money and fold up shop and put everybody on or have to lay everyone off there. So that is an important part of the act, but I think it's going to be very interesting, and I suspect the government will be very accommodating for extenuating circumstance. But that is literally a portion of this act.
Mhm. Peter, everyone is seeing the impact of this pandemic that we have going
Right.
on now, and there's nobody's unaffected. We've heard a lot of talk about restaurants and local retail, but and there's been some talk about the transportation, the infrastructure, aviation specifically. But I've been kind of surprised that there hasn't been more discussion about that. I mean, their ridership is down. I think I heard 95% or something along
Yeah,
those
it's
lines.
much more than the 90 I quoted from
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah, it's just a major impact. And so, as far as KSA is concerned, we're dedicated to walking along with our airport clients and helping them find the resources that they need and working through these situations. Is there anything that we could do from a planning perspective, from a developing CIP projects or something along those lines that could help some of these airports be more prepared
Yeah,
to
that's a good
attract
point.
this funding?
Yeah, we can. Now, I cut you off there just at the last to be more prepared for what was that, Hunter?
Well, to make it through this storm,
Oh,
to
yes, yes. Okay, that's what I thought you were going to say, but
yeah,
I was just trying to make sure that I fully understood it. We can re-examine the capital needs of airports. I have a number of years of experience as an airport manager, as we've talked about. We have several people on our staff very familiar with financial operations of airports. We can certainly help any of our clients that might be trying to figure out how can I look at this in a sustainable format to get me through this? We're glad to work with any of our clients, taking a look at what they can postpone, maybe taking a look at prioritizing operational funds to get them through this particular period. We're glad to help any of our clients with that.
very good. Well, Peter, thank you so much. Caroline, thank you for being here and asking some questions of Peter. I think this has been very informative, and I know over the next week or two, there may be more information that comes out from the FAA, and I think you'd be willing to jump on this call again
I
with us.
will, and we owe it to our clients. I would like to drill down a lot deeper on the $100 million for general aviation airports, so we can get a better sense. Part of that helping these airports right now is forecasting what that slug of money might be,
That's right.
and I would really like to get to the bottom of that.
Good. Well, thank you for doing that and being
My
available
pleasure.
to our client base. And Caroline, any closing comments from you?
I don't have any.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, guys, we will break it right here. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Stay safe. Bye bye.